again. In the first lesson, the first video lesson, I spoke a good deal about the intelligibility of human action. That is, its logical coherence, etc. In this second lesson, in fact, we'll be talking about two general areas of ethics. And in fact, the intelligibility, the logic, we might say, is quite different in these two different areas. The first area that we'll look at is the ethics of sexuality and reproduction. And the second area, what we might call the logic of killing. And as I said, we'll see that, that these two areas work quite differently. So obviously what we're continuing to do is to try to understand from the inside how ethics works. So let's begin with sexuality. That is the ethics of sexuality and reproduction, some related matters. And the primary thing that we have to realize here is that in the ethics of sexuality, there's a central model, a central act. In fact, it's a central basic act which determines what the morality of a particular sexual action is, that is, whether it's a moral act or an immoral act. That is, and this central act, this central model, is the marital act, the conjugal act. It's fairly important to realize, in fact, this is a difference between Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, Albert the Great. It's fairly important to realize that the unit that is the basic unit of intelligibility is not simply sexual intercourse, but it's marital intercourse. And this is much tied up with the idea that marriage itself, according to Christian morality, according to Thomas, also in fact Albert the Great, marriage itself is intelligible. It's a reasonable thing to do. In fact, it's man's most reasonable way of dealing with sexuality. And so when we try to determine the morality of sexual acts, we naturally compare them to the one clearly intelligible act in the sexual sphere, and that is the marital act, that is a conjugal act, an act between a man and a woman who are married one to the other. What we're talking about here in talking about the conjugal act is we're talking about a basic act, something which we also mentioned, which I also mentioned in the first section, that is the basic act which stands immediately before the person as he acts. And that's pretty much determined, or at least fairly well determined, by the object. So an act of intercourse, marital intercourse, conjugal intercourse, on the part of either spouse has as its object the other spouse, and so it's very much a physical analysis that must be done. And yet, as I also emphasized in the first lesson, these are intelligible things. We're talking about the use of bodies, the use of physical things in an intelligible way. So the conjugal act is basic. It's a basic type of thing that can be done. Now, when we talk about basic acts such as this, what makes them important is their very simplicity. Another example would simply be the act of telling the truth, truth-telling. And there's something pure and simple. Its intelligibility is all there in the very notion of saying the truth. There are no parts or no circumstances to have to deal with. We can just look at that basic act and recognize, for instance, that act is good in itself. Similarly, the conjugal act, the marital act, is good in itself. The other side of this, that is, if you want to say the other side of the coin, are bad acts. That is, bad acts which are the counterparts, that is, the negative counterparts to these basically good acts. And just as the good side of basic acts are always good, the bad side, or at least they are good in themselves. It's not always good to have, for instance, sexual intercourse, even with your wife, but the act itself, in its simplicity, is good. And similarly, truth-telling is in itself good. But when you go directly against that, and for instance, tell a falsehood or tell a lie, or perform some sort of sexual act which is not the conjugal act, automatically, immediately, that becomes immoral. And this is the root, this idea is the root of the idea which the church often mentions in its documents of moral absolutes, which are almost always absolute moral prohibitions. Things are absolutely morally prohibited if they go against something which is so basic in its own goodness that the flip side of them, that is, in fact, their perversion, is necessarily perverse. There's no room, there's no wiggle room there. They have to be immoral. In the first lesson, in fact, I talked about about language and about the idea of a whole language being intelligible, being ordered, a whole culture being ordered. This is never going to happen, but we can imagine it. And talking about the intelligibility of a paragraph or a sentence. And in fact, we can get down to the intelligibility of words that might be intelligible in themselves but not fit into the sentence. What we have with the violation of a basic act, that is like an immoral sexual act, can be compared to a word or something which purports to be a word but in fact isn't a word. So we're at this point we're down to the most basic units of ethics, and we're finding something unintelligible at that very lowest level. And that, as I've been saying, is what generates the fact that there are some actions which are inherently, that is, intrinsically evil, that is intrinsically not to be done. So to go on then to talk just a bit and give some examples of having to do with sexuality and the conjugal act. One example of a sexual act which would not be conjugal would obviously be adultery. And adultery is simply always wrong. But it's always wrong precisely because it violates that core, that kernel of intelligibility, which is the marital act, the conjugal act. Adultery can, in fact, make sense in its own sense, I mean, in its own right, so to speak, but it cannot fit into a larger picture of how we ought to behave morally. Similarly, an act like masturbation falls short of the conjugal act, and therefore it cannot fit into the system of intelligibility, which is marriage. Okay, it simply doesn't fit in. I mean, if we were to use the example also from the first lesson of the Army and the various parts in the Army, if a private, if a soldier has a gun, has a weapon which has a part which is simply broken, well, that's not going to help the point. It's not going to help the Army get to where it needs to go because there's something which is not functioning. There's something which lacks intelligibility. And so we find a similar thing in marriage. So, for instance, with an act of masturbation, for instance, even within marriage, is that there's something inherently incoherent about it, and therefore it's not going to help the couple achieve what they ought to be achieving by their very marriage. That is, they're not going to get to the end of their own marriage as it's constituted by nature in an intelligible, reasonable way. The church has formulated the properties of the conjugal act, and they've done this primarily within the context of of canon law. And obviously in canon law, the church is interested in saying very often when we have a marriage, when we're dealing with a marriage, whether a marriage in canon law, unfortunately, it's often a matter of dissolving or declaring null marriages. And so you have to have criteria for saying just exactly when do we have a marriage. And so everything, much of the intellectual content, the theoretical content of the canon law of marriage comes down to the definition of the conjugal act. And the conjugal act has been defined in canon law as having, as meeting certain criteria. And among these criteria are that the act be engaged in with full consent, that is of both parties, and also that that act be open to new life, that is, that there not be the use of contraception, and finally that there be one flesh unity, that is, that the wife and the husband actually come together in one flesh unity, that there's physical contact between them. And in fact, that criteria is that last criterion is excluded by the use of prophylactics or condoms. This is the example I used in the last example, or sorry, in the last lesson. A question that obviously arises here, or arises after not much thought, is that whether it's possible for a sterile couple to be open to life. And well, we know, in fact, that according to the church, in fact, according to human history, within human history, most human societies have, in fact, recognized that it's possible for sterile couples to marry. So it is possible for them to perform a genuinely marital act in order to begin their marriage. The question then becomes, well, how can you say that a sterile couple is open to life? And in fact, the way that we have to understand that phrase, open to life, according to the church, is simply that no one can intentionally, that is, using their intention and knowing they're doing it, etc., no one can intentionally put any sort of barrier or prevent conception in any way. And that would mean that the couple was closed to life. So as long as someone does not do anything like that, well, then the act, even if it's between two sterile people, or at least the couple itself is sterile, in that case it's considered open to life, insofar as life is not deliberately excluded, that is possible life, that is children. In the case of the sterile couple, it's also the case that it's immoral, according to the church, for a sterile couple to use prophylactics, for them to use a condom. And the reason for this has not so much to do with contraception, but rather with that phrase which I've already used, that is one flesh unity, is that it's part of the definition of the conjugal act, that the man and his wife have to come together in a full physical way and sexual way, and that in fact excludes. That's what makes it's immoral, in fact, to use condoms even in marital intercourse, and even if the couple are sterile and haven't the capability of conceiving in any case, or at least they think not. This, in fact, has been an area of dispute in recent years, and there have been a number of people that have resisted the idea that the ban on contraception of the church could have to do with something so physical, so physical, for instance, as condoms, etc. And the tendency, at least among certain very solid Catholics, has been to say that, well, what's wrong with contraception is that it's anti-possible life. And what that does is it takes the whole theology of marriage, in fact, the philosophy of marriage, into a different area. In fact, it brings it into the category of the fifth commandment, which has to do with killing or not. It's interesting that in a recent encyclical of the Holy Father that he's rejected that approach and says explicitly that the analysis of the conjugal acts has to do, or it falls under the sixth commandment. So it's a question of sexuality, not of intending or not intending to bring about possible life. Let's now go to the second area of ethics. And I mentioned at the beginning that the logic of this area of ethics, this sector of ethics, is quite different from the first. And in fact, we have to admit that it's quite a bit more complicated. That is, in this case, that is in the case of killing, we can't simply look to one model, like the conjugal act, in order to see whether our act is matching that, or whether it corresponds to that act. And the problem is that when we're talking about the ethics of killing, there is no one model to look at. In fact, when we're talking about the ethics of killing, we're talking about whether my act, for instance, of killing another could possibly be moral. So we can't use simply living as the model to be followed in my act, because in fact the living that's at issue here is the life of the other person. And in a sense, I mean, in a very real sense, no one chooses, no one has the intention to live. One simply lives. So it's in that sense, it's not a human act, or it's not a moral act. That is simply to live. I mean, we can occasionally have the intention to continue to live, but we don't wake up in the morning and say to ourselves, well, I intend to live today. And so anyhow, but the point is that when we're in this realm of ethics, that is, when we're talking about the ethics of killing, that we don't have the same sort of model. What we have instead is a sort of central default principle. And this default principle says basically, avoid taking life. But being a default principle, what it says is that this is a general rule to be followed, but there are considerations that we need to take into account which determine whether that default principle is going to apply. In a way, what we're talking about is a principle which only clicks in certain circumstances, and in other circumstances clicks out. That is, it's not applicable. But it still determines logically this whole sector of ethics. Now, a very central article in Thomas Aquinas for the ethics of killing is in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, that is the Secunda Secundae, and the article in question is Article 64, or sorry, it's Question 64 in Article 7, and it's a very, very important piece of writing in which Thomas sets out certain principles for this particular sector of ethics. And that article, and I'll just refer to it as 64.7 for to be brief, that article is divided into two sectors. The first sector talks about personal self-defense, and what Thomas Aquinas says is that when someone is being attacked, when it's a case of personally defending himself, that person can, in fact, morally kill. This is a place where the default principle no longer applies, so it clicks out, so to speak. So when you're in a situation in which you have to defend yourself personally, well, then you can do it. And the reason that you can do it, he says, is that the killing or the death of the assailant is beside the intention. Praeter intentionem is the phrase that he uses. And he also says that the person that kills has to use proportionate means. So you can't use a lethal means, which is too strong for that particular situation. We'll come back to that issue. So that's the first section of that article. The second section of 64.7, in fact, talks not about personal self-defense, but public self-defense. In fact, he mentions soldiers and also other officers of the law. And he says that in defending themselves, it's interesting that he still talks about self-defense. He says, in defending themselves, in fact, they can intend to kill. So it's perfectly moral for a soldier to intend to kill. That's a very, very important point, because what it shows is that in this very central principle, in this very central article for the ethics of killing, is that the issue is not simply what is intended. Okay, it's not simply a question of what is in our mind, what we mean to be doing. That's not what determines whether the default principle clicks in or clicks out. It's another factor. Okay, it's the fact of, in fact, it's intention. It's possible to intend to kill and to do that morally. That is, if we're in a certain situation, for instance, in which the public weal, that is the city or the nation, licenses that particular act of killing. And then in that case, it can be intended. The question then becomes, or presents itself, well, how do we determine when such situations present themselves, or how do we know that, in fact, it is moral for soldiers, for instance, to kill? I mean, again, as I said, we're trying to get to the heart, see morality from the inside. How in fact, do we determine these things, that there is a difference between self-defense and public defense? And the answer, and it's quite apparent in 64.7, in that article of Thomas Aquinas, is that what we do, first of all, is we look to the law. We look to, as I say in the written lectures, the first thing that Thomas Aquinas does is he reaches for his law books. So although Thomas does, first of all, reach for his law books, that is, consider what is in the law, this is not to say that morality simply depends on what is written in law books in a particular society. For that would end us, that would take us immediately into relativism, and what we're looking for is moral truth. The point, rather, is this: is that Thomas follows an Aristotelian methodology in his moral analysis, and that involves always, first of all, considering all the opinions, that is, the reputable opinions that are before him, and then in order to get the basic material, and then sifting through that and seeing what's contradictory, what contradicts other laws, and until you come up with a system of law which is coherent, which is intelligible. And when he reaches for his law books, or when he invokes the law, as he does in 64.7, what he's invoking, in fact, is a sort of perfect system of law. That is, a perfect system of law which would be consistent with natural law and eternal law, etc., and which would correspond as much as possible to the nature of human beings. And okay, so that's what he's determining. That's what he allows to determine what decides us to accept certain acts, for instance, acts of personal self-defense, as moral and others as immoral, etc. Okay. So let's just to conclude, let me just mention a couple of things about, first of all, personal self-defense, and then about public self-defense. And personal self-defense, I mentioned originally that is when I originally mentioned 64.7, that important article in Thomas Aquinas, that he talks about intention, that is, he's saying that when you are attacked and you are defending yourself, what happens is that that death, the death of the assailant, is beside your intention, and therefore your act is moral. And he also uses the phrase there that you must use proportionate means to repel that attack. And the only point I want to make here is that, in fact, proportionate means is very much tied up with intention itself. And so, for instance, if you imagine that a person is in a situation in which there's a tripwire somehow rigged up so that if there's an attacker, a man can always pull a lever or something, the tripwire comes up and the attack stops. Okay, so let's presume he's in that sort of a situation. But he also happens to have a large caliber deer rifle, next to his chair. And so someone comes up attacking him, let's say with a gun, and instead of using the tripwire, which he's certain would function in this case, he picks up his deer rifle and blows the guy away, and he kills him. In that case, he would be using disproportionate means. And in fact, what that does, when you've got that sort of a situation, it's clear that the person who uses the deer rifle intends to kill. Okay, and that's precisely why he doesn't use the tripwire. So proportionate means and intention to kill are very much tied together. And let me just finally say a word about public self-defense. That is the self-defense that soldiers engage in. And what you have there is the difference, as I mentioned several times already, is that the difference is that a soldier is permitted to intend to kill. I mean, he's part of, in this way, it's like medicine. He's part of an intelligible structure which has reason. It's a reasonable thing to defend oneself in a just war, for instance. And given that he's in this intelligible and therefore moral structure, and that structure is set up in order to kill enemies that are attacking unjustly, a soldier in that sort of a context, within that sort of intelligible structure, can in fact intend to kill, simply because of the structure. The structure allows him to do it. Let me just say one final point about the ethics of war, and that is just a very brief comment. There are more remarks in the written lessons. A short comment about just war, and the Catechism put out by John Paul II is very good. It sets out the various criteria for just war, and it's also important to realize that there are two types of ways of analyzing acts of war, that is, or acts which have to do with war. Some of those acts actually occur within a war and within an army. That is, after a just war, presumably just war, has already been declared. And in that case, what we are using, those type of acts, they fall under the second section of 64.7. So intention is important there, and it's also allowable. And but there are also rules there. And one of the rules, a very important rule, is that the object of an act of a soldier, a genuinely military act of a soldier, the object must be an enemy. So the object cannot be an innocent person. And but in any case, there are a number of rules which apply to soldiers as they're in the army, as they're fighting. But there's another whole category of criteria having to do with war, and these are the criteria which have to do with going to war. In other words, this area is called the jus ad bellum. So that is justice as it pertains to going to war. And there we find the criteria, which you can find by looking up this section in the Catechism. There we find the criteria set out by the church, not by necessarily one individual. In fact, the criteria come from Augustine, St. Augustine, also Thomas Aquinas, and they've been further developed in the more recent teaching of the church. But the one point I want to leave you with is that those criteria are much more similar to what we find in the first part of 64.7. That is, they have to do with intention, or they have to do with self-defense. So the criteria for going to war have much more to do with making sure that a war, in order to be declared just, has to be in some sense an act of self-defense. It has to be either an act of self-defense or some means of redressing wrongs or injustices suffered in the past. So in that way, the intention of the warring nation, the justly warring nation, will always be good rather than simply death, that is, to kill the other nation or the other soldiers. On the other hand, as we need to emphasize, once that situation is in place, that is, once you have a just war in an army which is fighting a just war, well then within that context there can be intentional killing. In fact, there has to be, because that's what an army is set up for. So those are some ideas having to do with ethics in general, and also the ethics of sexuality and killing. The whole thing, I would be the first to acknowledge, is complicated. It's not simple. However, I think that by putting our minds to it, by many people putting their minds to it, and in fact putting their minds to it over many centuries, that we can find organization in it. We can find intelligibility. And that it is in intelligibility, in rationality, that morality exists. Thank you.